You're listening to Codepunk with Bill Ahern and Michael Zuhl, a podcast about the intersection between programming, technology, and the digital lifestyle.
Michael, how you doing, man?
I'm doing good. It's probably been about 3-4 weeks, right?
I think 3 weeks.
Might have been 3. Yeah. No, we've been getting more on the ball and getting these recordings in sooner and sooner. And that's kind of funny. I was speaking to a guy in technology the other day, just happened to listen to our podcast, and he asked about the twins. So apparently I talk about the twins way too much at the beginning of the podcast. But usually it's because when you and I sit down and do these recordings, it's roughly around 8:15. It used to be around 7:45. So it's almost right after the kids have been, put in bed. And usually if they have like a day where they're running around a lot and they get tired, you put them down, they go to sleep right away. And then some days they don't. So that when you go to put them down, they're not exactly tired, and it causes a little bit of ruckus. So you and I usually have to alter our time slightly depending on what time they go down, just to see, in case you hear any screaming in the background or kids banging on walls or anything like that. And then I don't want to speak too loud, even though I generally don't anyway, but I'm out here in the kitchen. I don't want to speak too loud to kind of wake them up. So usually there's always a twin story simply because I just had to deal with them. But apparently people are recognizing that. So it doesn't seem like it's a podcast without talking about the twins in some sense, right?
Well, hey, man, you got young child twins. It's going to be fresh on your mind. I'm sure a lot of people can relate.
There's another thing fresh on my mind. Actually, it was on my mind during our last recording, but I didn't bring it up. I actually think it came out maybe a day or two after our last recording. But I have to know, how do you feel about the Blade Runner trailer?
Oh, I'm super jacked. I mean, I'm excited. I think that Ryan Gosling is a really good actor, and I when I say he's a really good actor, I really want to clarify what I mean. So some of the movies that I've seen him in, like Drive. These are very atmospheric, moody movies that are more art house, right? So he can carry a movie that's based more on like heavy silence, right, and like physicality and just tension. And not that Blade Runner was a lot of that, but Blade Runner also wasn't an action movie. It was very tense. There's a lot of scenes setting up. There's a lot of Harrison Ford
standing there drinking.
Yeah, right. Drinking, or just like trying to, Harrison Ford was doing a lot of different acting that he had done in other movies at that time, with Star Wars and Indiana Jones, which is more physical, and his characters were more cocky. This character was almost like a recluse and kind of weird and awkward. So anyway, I'm very excited because I think that Ryan Gosling is about as near as perfect a pick of an actor you can get, if this movie is successful, I have no doubt probably they're going to carry the franchise forward. I can't think of anyone better to pass the torch to than Ryan Gosling. So I'm excited.
I absolutely agree. And the visuals of the movie look stunning, and but they don't overtake the visuals of the original film, which I thought was great. It carries a lot of the same atmosphere, the same style of cinematography over. And you're right. Anytime somebody has a complaint about, Ryan Gosling as an actor, I always say, look, you need to go rent Drive, because here's a film where he was, the strong silent type, but he rarely spoke. And there's moments where just his facial expressions and his stance and his demeanor that he's able to portray, there's a lot of emotion and a lot of character in that just by his actions without him having to speak. And when you see something like that, and then I think about, what a Blade Runner is and how a film like Blade Runner, should be portrayed, I just think he was an excellent choice for it.
Yeah, I agree. So I have high hopes. I mean, I'm not, naturally, I think it goes without saying, I would of course be expected to be very hyped for this movie, and I am, but I'm also not. I'll just say that I'm not cautiously optimistic. I'm just straight up like looking forward to it. I really feel like with Scott in the production role, I would have preferred him directing, but that's okay. Apparently I can't remember the director's name, and I'm not really familiar with him, but another film aficionado friend of mine was very excited. Apparently the director is somebody who's got credentials as somebody as an authentic, artist. So it sounds like you got a good cast, you got a good group of people putting it together. So I'm pretty comfortable that it's going to be a good movie.
Right. Yeah. Me too. I think it's phenomenal. And cyberpunk films in general, actually many sci-fi films, they always have this concept of, when you talk about projections of the future, we missed out on flying cars, right? We don't have them. But one thing that they didn't necessarily predict is this idea of the World Wide Web and the internet. And it's kind of funny because a lot of the cyberpunk films or a lot of the cyberpunk genre and even straight sci-fi like Star Trek, there is this idea of terminals, of terminal windows and text that's communicated across the network. But the whole idea of a World Wide Web of what we experience today is not really in those things.
No, it's not. It was, because the way they saw it from Star Trek up into even the cyberpunk stuff that we fell in love with, say around the, mid to late 80s, early, I guess the whole 80s, right? Blade Runner is 82. Right. And then stuff leading up to the early 90s was all analog. It was like nuclear power and analog interfaces. Digital wasn't something we saw coming.
Right. And when we think about today's day and age, it's kind of funny because here we have all of these smartphones, these tablets, these devices that certainly are not analog. They're definitely not. There's terminals on them and there's terminals that can be used, but for the most part, you're talking about GUI interfaces, graphical user interfaces on a phone, whether it's an app or whether it's a desktop application where there's a cursor and there's buttons and there's a design and there's things. And you and I had mentioned a couple of episodes ago that later this year, late September, I'll be speaking at the EduI conference again, and one of them is on progressive web apps. And progressive web apps seems to be this next step, not just for mobile and desktop as far as apps, but as far as creating this sort of next step of the internet. So it's kind of so I don't know if you remember this, but when the iPhone first came out, a lot of people asked Steve Jobs about, hey, are you going to open this up for third party? Are you going to open this for third party apps? And initially he was a little hesitant and he was like, look, you got the best third party app right here. It's called the internet. He was referring to Safari, the Safari app for the web browser. Build apps for the web for this thing. And then he realized he could take a 30% cut if he sold things through an app store. So we got littered with these apps, and we had the Apple App Store. Then we had the Android App Store. Amazon has their own App Store. And then, of course, Microsoft has their App Store with the Windows Store. So you ended up with those walled gardens. And there was such a problem with people being # to target each one of those devices because, of course, Android was written in Java and, Objective-C was for iOS. Windows used C#. And if you wanted to target devices, you had to basically pick and choose. And then that's how we ended up with things like Accelerators, Titanium, things like Cordova and Ionic, the former Phone Gap, where you're trying to build with one thing and then target all of these platforms together. And you end up with things like, Xamarin as well.
Right. And because you would also have fragmentation, right? Because what you're seeing now, I, as a Windows Phone user, I don't have access to certain apps or certain updates to those apps. The Uber app is always behind everyone else's. And there's just a lot of apps I don't have access to. If I wanted to use Lyft, for example, as ride sharing, there is no app for Lyft. But if they built a web page, which by the way, they don't have, like Uber doesn't have it either. You either download the app or that's it, or you go find an Android or iPhone device to use to hail your cab. But, they didn't make a web page for doing this, for accessing their services.
Right. And Mozilla, slightly ahead of their time, came out with the Firefox OS, which didn't take off, of course, and has subsequently been end of lifed by them. I think it's still out there as an open source project called Gecko to something or other. And basically their OS served up only web apps. They were progressive web apps. They had an app store, but the app store was filled with basically shortcuts to progressive web apps that you can then, download, which would pin to your screen. And the reason why I say they're ahead of their time is because you're starting to see a trend towards people building these things called progressive web apps. And of course, a progressive web app is something that both degrades gracefully in the event that functionality isn't there, but also if the functionality is there, it's able to scale up towards that functionality. And these are pieces of functionality. They're HTML5. They're the new JavaScript APIs. They basically treat web applications more like desktop applications, offering them more functionality and more ability. And it's really being championed by Google. So Google, Mozilla supports it. Edge supports it. Google supports it. They're all kind of all in. And we'll talk about Microsoft. They mentioned a lot about it at a Build conference recently. Safari's the only one who's not technically on board just yet. So Apple is kind of hopefully the people who are working with WebKit, which Safari is based on, are starting to go all in on it. But right now it's mostly, Android, Google Chrome and Android have the best support for it. Firefox is probably second best, and then Edge is starting to pick up and even out with the other people. So I don't know how much.
And just to clarify though, too, so these, when we talk about apps, when we talk about progressive web apps, these are websites that can run on a mobile device with the same kind of speed and interactivity as a native app, right?
Right, for the most part. And you'll have to excuse me. I knocked my entire microphone over just a minute ago. So that loud bang you heard, that was
right.
me getting a little too excited about web development because I'm a geek.
Right. So let me ask you this, and if I'm jumping ahead, that's fine, and you could just say that we'll get into it. But are you looking to explain the difference between a hybrid app, which is basically what things like Cordova did, which is take up your JavaScript, CSS, and your HTML and bundle it, and where you could actually export it into those app stores, whereas a progressive web app doesn't? Am I getting too far ahead?
No, you're not.
Okay.
Because what I'd like to talk about is actually, because I know you have experience with PhoneGap, so you have experience with developing an app and, in a technology, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and then basically using those technologies to kind of build out deploy it basically into a shell, whether it's iOS or it's Android, and that goes into the App Store.
Right. Those would be the hybrid apps, yes.
Those would be the hybrid apps. And what Google has really been allowing is this idea of a web app that, with the right pieces of technology added to it, suddenly become almost as good as a native web app. And it all starts with basically what's called a manifest file. So if you have a website and in the root of that website, you add a manifest.json file, and you then add a meta tag to your layout or to your index. And inside that meta file, that meta tag, you point to your manifest, you're able to add in a bunch of information that tells the browser about your application. And you can basically set your application to be in standalone mode, where basically and I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. The first thing you could do is basically give it an icon. You can point to the icon. You can point to background colors, and you can point to things like the way to install it, right? So what this manifest file basically allows you to do is identify different pieces of functionality that you want to have. And the way Chrome kind of handles it is, if you go to a website on your phone, if you go to a website that's a progressive web app more than once, so on the second time around, it basically recognizes that you visited this place before, and oh, hey, by the way, this offers the ability to add this to your home screen. Would you like to install it, basically? And you click OK, and what it'll do is it'll take that icon and pin it to the screen, and it won't look like a bookmark that you pinned to the screen. It'll look like an actual icon, like any other Android app that's on your phone. And because you set it to standalone mode, when you click on it and it loads up, it gives you a splash page, because you can identify the splash page inside a manifest file, and then it'll load up without the URL bar and with the color scheme that you set. So it's just like having everything that you would have if you built a hybrid app, only without actually having to go through the App Store in order to get it. If somebody visits your website multiple times on the web, you can offer for them to save it basically to their screen. And so when they go to save it into their screen, it looks and it works and it feels, if you've designed it correctly, exactly like a web app or exactly like a mobile app.
Which I think is great, but I have the thing that immediately comes to mind, and I can tell you now that I've much more interest in building a progressive web app moving forward with some projects that I have in mind in terms of the mobile space. But I wonder, and I don't want to get into the metrics of how users download, use, and uninstall their apps, because there's a lot of common knowledge around that if you're a developer in the mobile space. But there's a lot of people who spend a lot of time exploring. They'll try something and statistically they'll delete it in a day, or they'll just never use it again. So I'm really curious about what kind of traction a progressive web app would offer a user over, say, having to go to the store, because it's the store that is the entry point, right? So if you get somebody to come to your site on a mobile browser, because they're there because maybe they found you through a web search, it might be more compelling to say, oh, this has got some sort of functionality that I can launch right off my phone. And I just wonder if users would be more interested in using that when they see it, when it's made available to them, as opposed to, say, just going and searching a store and maybe your app comes up because it's popular. Do you know what I mean? Am I making sense there?
No, you absolutely are. And they did some statistics, and I don't have them offhand, but they did do some statistics on web apps versus mobile apps. And honestly, it's not that easy to find a good app in the App Store. Short of the ones that Apple or that Android say these are the great ones, unless you specifically know what you're looking for, you're not going to find random stuff. But you will find random stuff when you search on the internet. Search for a particular topic, search for a particular thing. You do that, and if you land on that page and then you come back to that page, hey, you want to pin it. So there are some statistics, and those statistics have shown that you're actually more likely to not just gain traction and gain installs, but also retain people through the progressive web app experience than you are through the App Store experience. But I'm going to give you a different, for instance. In particular, for my job, none of the apps that we develop can go through the App Store. So if they can't go through the App Store, they need to go through a special provisioning profile, which is at least how iOS sets things up. And in this special provisioning profile, it downloads these other apps. You have to basically leave your phone locked and put in a PIN code. And if you put in your PIN code wrong 10 different times, it'll wipe it, because it deals with secure data and HIPAA information and things like that.
Right.
So,
but these apps are sideloaded?
These apps are basically loaded. There's a separate app that basically gives you an option of ones that can also be installed other than like the 4 or 5 that they install. So it's not really sideloaded. It's official, but it's through basically a third-party provisioning profile, which is what Apple uses to set up like the security mechanisms and things you can do and you can't do. So 42% of the people at my place of work actually have the provisioning profile installed. Only 42%. So it presents a barrier to entry, and good luck at getting those people to install all of these additional things on their phone. So that was, by the way, that wasn't everybody. That was faculty. Just faculty. Only 42% of faculty.
Oh wow, that's much lower than I would expect for faculty.
Yes. So everybody else, it's even a lower percentage than that. So when we went to develop this app, it was basically, well, okay, what do? If we develop native apps, there's no guarantees that they'll be installed. So we're going to have to go with a mobile app. And when we decided to go with a mobile app, we started to look at some of the other pieces of technology out there. And then that's when we came upon progressive web apps. Even though it wasn't going to work in iOS, we knew that we could at least target people with Android phones to offer them a better experience. And the better experience starts very easily. It starts with that manifest file. Things like the name of the app, a short name of the app, all the various icon launchers you can put into the file, the start URL, just so you know what URL it came from. And all you have to do is add that link in the top so that you can point to the manifest file. I mean, it's relatively easy. And I'm sorry, I believe I said it was a meta tag. It is not a meta tag. It's a like CSS link, but rel equals manifest. So this web app manifest is basically what sets it up, but that's not it. So there's a ton more functionality that you can build into this thing. You can access native components such as the camera API. You can send push notifications. You can cache information. You can set up things like background sync. But it requires a very specific tool in order to do that, and that's a tool called a service worker. But before we get to the service worker, I just wanted to mention that because Google supports it so completely, when you're writing these yourself and you need to test it, obviously you're inside of a web browser. If you use Chrome's built-in tools, there's a tab there for application. If you click on application and your particular website has a manifest, it'll actually parse that data and you can see what it would look like. You can see what the launcher would look like. You can see what the colors would look like. You can see what the name would look like. And then you can kind of dig in deeper as far as, all of the different variables, all of the different properties that you can add to the manifest. So it's really pretty cool. And then, like I said, the app install banners are there, which is pretty neat. They work quite well on Android. They work well in Chrome. You can actually mimic that. They have an add to home screen button inside the Chrome tools. And if you press that, it'll then ask you if you wanted to install it. These are all great technologies. And you know what? These are technologies that you have used before. I can almost guarantee it, because if you were in a Firefox browser or if you were in a Chrome browser and you've gone to some place like Facebook or you've gone to Twitter, you may have gotten a pop-up that says, would you like to receive notifications when you're, in your browser?
That's right. Yeah, I have.
Those are parts of the Progressive Web App. That's the push notification API being sent through the Progressive Web App, basically.
And those are involved with the service worker, right?
Yes. So a service worker is basically a new piece of technology. It's a JavaScript worker, basically, that you install in the root of your application, and inside your layout file or your index page or whatever piece of technology you're using, you basically will check to see if you can actually use a service worker, and then you register that service worker through JavaScript with the web browser. So the web browser basically registers this so that it can then talk about your application, to your application through offline, etc. So the important part of the service worker, at least for my usage, has been the ability to work with the cache API. Now, there used to be something not that long ago. I want to say if it was a .app cache file, I forget, but it was a way to basically cache files and cache data for offline usage. They completely did away with that, and they've gone to this kind of cache API thing, which the service workers can help you with. You basically define your cache name, and then you set an event listener to install the cache or open the cache, and it'll install the cache into your system, into your application, and then you can pull from that cache whenever you want to. The second piece of functionality that goes quite well with that is the fetch API. This is basically an asynchronous call that intercepts between your calls to your web server and back. So if you are using various forms of AJAX calls within your JavaScript and you make a call to your web server, it'll get intercepted by the fetch API. You can then use that code, which is inside your service worker, to basically say, hey, do I already have this in my cache? And if you already have it in your cache, you can then return the cached stuff, which is cached locally. You're either using local storage or you're using session storage or you're using IndexedDB. But you can pull from that cache rather than making a request to the server. If it doesn't find it in the cache, it can then request it from the server. So that's a neat way to kind of get an intermediate piece of functionality between the data that you're requesting and the actual data it returns. If you didn't have the fetch API and you didn't have the service worker, you would have to do this manually, where basically when you go to make a call, you would have to say, well, wait, before I make this AJAX call, let me check to make sure I don't already have this data locally. Oh, okay, I have it locally. Oh, no, I don't. Then go do something. So you don't have to edit any of your code. All your code can be AJAX calls, just complete AJAX calls. You don't have to worry about the cache or the fetch at all. Then in your service worker, you have the fetch, and you can write your functionality in there to either pull from the cache or go straight to the API, to the RESTful call that you're looking for.
Which is pretty awesome. Obviously for speed, and that's probably what helps to make the progressive web apps on a mobile phone feel responsive at a native app level, I would imagine. Now, the thing that I'm curious about and this is where I'm fuzzy, so I'm actually asking you, wasn't Apple's they were slow to get on the progressive web app train because it wasn't involved with something to do with the service workers? Did you read about that?
I did not read about that. I'm assuming that WebKit had some issue with it. So service workers are relatively new, and of course they all go through committee as far as approval, and sometimes some people think they have better ideas than others. I'm not sure what the WebKit idea was with the service workers, but that's no excuse when it comes to something like your manifest JSON file and be able to install the app to screen. Apple does offer functionality where if you use custom meta tags, you can point to, this is the icon that I want, and yes, I think this should be an application. And since it's an application, you can set it to standalone mode, and then when you go to the website, you can click, the little settings thing at the bottom and basically bookmark it, but you can save it to your screen. When you save it to the screen, it'll use the icon that you specified. And if you set it to standalone mode, it'll have the URL bar be absent. So they do have similar functionality. They're just not using the standards, and they're not supporting, service workers and all of these additional APIs to the extent that Mozilla and even Edge, as well as Chrome are doing it.
Yeah.
So I think it's typical. I mean, Safari has been behind on a lot lately, including, CSS standards. I don't know if it's a part of the culture or if it's just slow to adopt or if there's just a kind of a wait and see approach. They did say that there are two things that they said that they were interested in. They're interested in this idea of progressive web apps, and of course they're interested in WebAssembly. But whereas Edge, I'm pretty sure Edge, Firefox, and Chrome support WebAssembly to a certain extent. WebKit and Safari do not.
No, they don't. In fact, I just kind of while we're discussing it, I went to the webkit.org. They have a status. So for all the different technologies in there, service workers are under consideration. So
Right.
they're not supported yet. They're considering it. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. Who knows?
Right. And a service worker is not the easiest thing to work with. The cache API and the fetch are probably the simplest one. You can really just copy and paste some code you might find on the internet and it'll work out of the box. But there are certainly caveats to it. And many of the examples that you'll see with caching and a service worker will use local storage as the example of where to store your data. And all of them come with the caveat of, if this were a production thing, you probably don't want to use local storage for this. You'll want to use something else. So of course they recommend IndexedDB. Now I just integrated IndexedDB as well as local storage into the Metron library that I've been putting together.
Right.
And let me tell you what a beast that is to work with. Simply because local storage and session storage are blocking technologies, they are not asynchronous. So when you go and you read from local storage, everything stops. And then of course, when that data comes out, everything resumes. So there is the potential for lag depending on how that access, occurs. I know in a previous application, maybe about 2 years ago, we had issues in Chrome with local storage slowing the application down. But when you have something like IndexedDB, which doesn't use promises, but it uses basically, a similar event loop, asynchronous style of data, I ended up wrapping it in promises and then returning those promises. So every call you make ends up being inside of a function that's basically the callback function. So whether it's setting data into the IndexedDB or retrieving it from the IndexedDB, you have to basically use it in promises and do the whole, promise. And then if it returns, put it in the then function, or do it in the catch, or do something with the catch if it fails. So so if you look at something like that and you combine that with the fact that the fetch, of course, returns a promise, the caching matches return a promise. Basically, almost everything that you deal with inside of the service worker, to a certain extent, is going to use promises because it's all going to be asynchronous. You're going to have a lot of code that's functions within functions, or it's functions that when they execute pass the results to a then function that's coming off of it in order to resolve the promise, in order to get the data from the resolved promise. It can get complicated, and that's just with caching. So when you start to load on some of the other points to it, it can get even crazier. In particular, the one feature that we did not get a chance to implement in the progressive web app that I built for work was basically push notifications, and using the notification API and the web push API, which this would work just like notifications on any other website or any other web app or any other mobile app, I should say, native app. So if you had a ding on Twitter and you get the little one badge, theoretically you could do the same thing with this.
Any plans to implement?
There are, but the problem with implementing something like this is that this basically is a publisher subscriber model. So much like anything else where it's pushed out to a device, those devices have to all be registered with something. So the vast majority of examples that you'll have when it comes to utilizing push notifications with progressive web apps are going to be with a messaging service like a Google Cloud Messaging. So basically you have to integrate with Google Cloud Messaging in order to, first you have to prompt the user to say, am I allowed to send you push notifications? And they say yes. And then once they say yes, you basically have to register their device with the messaging service so that the messaging service basically has the ID of the device and the capacity to basically send that out. And then in your application itself, when you need to send data out to a bunch of different phones, you basically have to connect with the messaging service, send them the message along with ID information, and it'll get the push notification on their phone. And the push notification can be just a standard one, or it can contain kind of rich content cards to a certain extent. So there's wiggle room as far as what your notification actually looks like. But the amount of code to do the push notifications is far more than the amount of code to do the caching. And we don't have access to Google Cloud Messaging. We have access to AWS. And although Amazon does have a notification service, their similar functionality to Google Cloud Messaging was actually in beta at the time. And we ran out of time. We had a due date of launching the application March 1st. I didn't promise them push notifications. I said it was something that we would look into, and we looked into it, and it was so new, and it would just push us so far past the deadline that it was something that we said, okay, you're just going to get a text message from, using Twilio or whatever, and then you're going to get an email, and you're just going to have to know that the app itself is the one thing that guarantees you to tell you what your data is in case you don't get the SMS or you don't get the email. But those are some of the key things. I mean, caching alone, the Cache API does a great deal to kind of save you, because when you actually start off in your service worker, you can specify the cache name, and you can actually specify URLs to cache. So if you have an application shell and you have all of these images and you have these CSS and you have this JavaScript, and you know that these are things that are going to be utilized across your app, but not actually, but can be cached right away. They're not going to change that often. You can put those URLs in there, and you can add it when the service worker is installed. Basically in your web browser, it will open up the cache, and it'll basically access all of those files, and it'll pre-cache all of them so that immediately, when it's registered, and if you're on a device and you get a splash screen, or if you're on your web browser and you're loading, it'll load all that data into cache relatively quickly, so that now everywhere else you go on the entire site, all that information, all of that data, all of those files are basically, sent from the cache rather than pulled from the web server again, or having to rely on the actual browser cache. The problem with that is that if you update one of your CSS files that's cached, you have to change the cache name. Otherwise, it won't recache anything.
Right, so you basically have to bust the cache.
Yes. So that's easy to do on fetches when you're using the fetch API to intercept data, because you basically, if you were to send an AJAX call that's supposed to do an insert, you know that you can bust out the cache because I just did an insert. But when you're sending files up to the server and, I just need to change my CSS file, and you push it up there, you basically have to build into your deployment a replacement for the cache name. What we ended up doing is using TFS and using a replace tokens build step inside of our definition, and that basically replaced the cache name with whatever the build number was. So anytime we did a build to the server, even though the files may not have been updated, at least we know, best case scenario, we're breaking the cache and they have to reload everything. So if you do a production push, once every 2 weeks, once every month, or even once every week, you at least know that that the cached items will get updated. So the other thing that I haven't had a good chance to look into a whole lot is background sync. So just like you have offline store, or just like you have the Cache API, And you can do offline storage with local storage or session storage or IndexedDB. You have this ability to basically sync up the data that you have stored locally with the data that you actually need. And why does this come in handy? Well, if you go offline and you need to still insert records or still update records, you're going to be able to update that information by saving it into the IndexedDB or saving it into the local storage. And then when you come back online, the background sync can be pinged that, hey, I'm back online. I'm going to sync this data back up to, back up to the server. Now, there's a lot of stuff you have to deal with that. If I'm offline and you're online and the database table has an auto increment key, you're liable to have updated information. You have new keys. And if my IndexedDB isn't built right and I have, indexes in there that match up for some reason, we're going to have errors and data loss. So it's a tricky situation to be able to do offline storage. You have to be very specific about your data structure. Probably the best way to do something like this would be to have some sort of an in database or something, basically somewhere where you store the data before workflowing it into an active database, which is something you might remember when both of us worked, with Dan not that long ago at BDI. He always had like his in database, his active, and his out database. So the in database basically is a snapshot, and then you push that out to your active database, which is where all of your stored data is. I mean, you could kind of handle it that way. It can get tricky. Looking at the IndexedDB stuff, it's basically like a document DB. So you handle it in much the same way you would handle any other document DB, and it has its own quirks. I'm not 100% sold on it. Local storage, and I'll sound like a lazy geek, but local storage is just so much easier to deal with. You can shove any type of data structure in there, and then you can pull it out, and you don't have to worry about the various event loops. IndexedDB is clearly more powerful because you can set keys, and you can basically pull the data out through the keys. But you have to be careful with the way you store the data inside of it. It can throw errors, and you really have to pay attention to structure. So anything complex is going to require somebody with, greater knowledge of how to build document DBs. And so now you have a front end. So now you need somebody on the front end who understands data structure and understands databases and how the flow of data works, as well as somebody on the back end, which, yes, there are full stack developers. I've been doing things from the front end all the way to the back end for quite a long time. But to me, it seems like that's asking a lot for complex applications. So I don't know if it's the right thing for complex applications, at least for offline storage.
Yeah, and particularly because a lot of the way the skill sets are divvied up right now, you've got back-end guys who are building APIs that'll do all the complex calculations and number crunching on the back end, and then they just send whatever data is going to be needed to that API, and then the front-end guys get it and present it in whatever way it needs to be. That sort of relationship between understanding data structures doesn't actually occur right now because progressive web apps, in this example, are still fairly new, so the need for front-end guys to know that kind of isn't there, which is tough.
Right. And when you're dealing with the potential for data to be out of sync, I think it presents, if the device or the app is being used as data collection that you then send up somewhere, and there's not necessarily a need to be in receipt of the most up-to-date data from some greater application, you're probably okay. But if the application itself needs to, I need to make a dynamic call to this thing and get this data, and then I need to compare it with this list, and I have to do these items. If you're really talking about standard CRUD operations for a relatively mid-size or even complex application, I think there's a reasonable expectation that you should be on the internet. There's very little excuse not to be in an enterprise situation like that. Somewhere where offline storage and background sync might come in handy is if you service like medical equipment and you end up in an area where you have no Wi-Fi signal because they didn't put it there, and you don't have a signal on your mobile application, in which case having a form on your phone that you can enter data into and then save, and then that syncs back up is probably adequate. But you're not going to be doing complex things in there. You're not going to take Salesforce down into the basement of a hospital to work on medical equipment and be entering into CRM information for various leads. You know what I mean? This is something like that's just not going to be done. Your need to be in an area where there's very little either Wi-Fi or a signal is going to be limited to situations where I think you have to do like service style work. And in that case, I think the app is probably adequately built for things like that for offline storage. But as far as pulling all this data, I mean, I'm a firm believer, and we built, we didn't do background sync in our app because we basically said there's all these Wi-Fi routers all over the place. You were asking for an app that is on a mobile phone. You were asking for an app that basically sends, assessments from one person to another person. And you have a reasonable expectation that person will receive it and immediately respond. That means you have a reasonable expectation of them being online, and we don't have to focus on the background sync. So what about on your end? I know you've been big into the hybrid apps, which is slightly different than the progressive web apps. We covered some things. There are a few other things out there as far as building out your native shell and accessing some native hardware, but those are all things that kind of fall in line with the newer JavaScript APIs as far as camera and device orientation, audio recording, image capture. So to me, the progressive web app aspect of building these things is more dealing with the service worker and the various pieces that the service worker kind of lets you get where it comes to caching, offline storage, the fetch API, and web push notification, and of course the web app manifest for installing it to your home screen and for basically being able to create it as a progressive web app. Oh, and by the way, real quick before we talk about before we talk about hybrid apps, is that at Build, Microsoft basically said that if you build a progressive web app, there's going to be an outlet for you to be able to put that progressive web app into the Windows Store. So it'll not only be discovered from the browser if you land there, but it'll also be discovered from the Windows Store, and both will be installed the same way, which I thought was pretty cool.
It's pretty fantastic and pretty powerful. And it's one of the things that draws me more towards progressive web apps now. I mean, I spent time and I built a couple apps, and none of them I really put on the store proper. Like they were just really kind of learning at a time where progressive web apps weren't even a thing. We were looking at, and we sort of discussed it before, there's a difficulty if you're building native apps, of course. I don't want to retread this, but every developer knows the difficulty. You have to know that language. You have to be able to compile on that platform, particularly with Mac, with iPhone apps. There's no emulator that you can run on anything that's not an Mac. So you're kind of, when you're looking for a solution that allows you to build something that is accessible to everybody, that you don't need separate developer teams for, it's very attractive. So that's what a former employer, that's what we were looking at, and yeah, I found the PhoneGap, then later became Cordova once Adobe bought PhoneGap and kind of broke off the licensing part from the core, application functions. It was great, and I knew, and at the time there was a lot of hybrid apps being built because of how easy they were, because all you need to know was JavaScript, HTML, CSS, and then things like Cordova and PhoneGap would take what you wrote and then it can compile it in a way to access the system APIs. So it was really great. I have no longer an interest in hybrid apps for two reasons. One, progressive web apps offer obviously a lot more functionality as you just laid out, but also it's very apparent when you just bundle up a website into an app and then call it a day, and then you put it on the App Store. They don't run as well. I mean, there's just a noticeable difference. So it was great. I think a time, and I don't want to disparage hybrid apps because I would imagine that over the time they've gotten better. But I just haven't built one in a long time, because even when we were building them, they were good enough. But now we have so many other options that the progressive web app, if you're not going to do native, a PWA just sort of seems like the natural next place to go.
Right. That's what I was going to ask you. I was wondering if you saw progressive web apps as kind of the next natural step away from hybrid apps into kind of a better way, into Steve Jobs's original idea of the greatest way to build, mobile apps.
Yeah, no, 100%. In fact, it's funny. XKCD, I was looking at a comic when I was doing research for this. Just kind of seeing what else was out there, because I'm interested in using Ionic, which is basically a hybrid of Angular and Cordova. So it's kind of funny. So, using some of the hybrid app stuff, but then kind of, evolving it a little bit. But XKCD, a popular nerd comic that probably our listeners already are familiar with, it was funny. So they had a strip and it just said, I'm going to just paraphrase it, but it said, I think the next step in mobile apps would be developing an application where you just have all the apps and you just download them and run them instantly. And then the caption beneath says, I thought I was clever until I realized I invented the web browser, because it is the most powerful application we have. You can access anything, anywhere. And if you have an internet connection, which you really, what are you doing on the web with that one? You can access all the information that you want, and websites are getting so complex now with so many JavaScript libraries that if we can make a way, just an easier way to get immediately to the website, right? Because it's really it's a nice one-step click on your homepage to get into, a utility, which is really a web page that you want to use.
Yep. Yeah, I think it's definitely the future. I kind of wish that Mozilla had stuck behind the Firefox OS just to see if any other people adopted it. It looks like Chrome. It looks like Google is really going to champion it, and there are other. So hopefully they champion on Android, not just in Chrome. But I'm very interested in seeing how it's going, and I don't think I'm going to build any more native web apps or hybrid apps. I think we're going to go all in on progressive web apps because it's still a website, and see where that takes us. Do you got any closing thoughts?
No, I think we covered it all pretty thoroughly.
All right, man. Until next time, talk to you guys later.
See you, everybody.
That's it for this episode of Codepunk. You can subscribe to this podcast on Google Play, iTunes, and Stitcher, or listen to it on the web at codepunk.io. You can find Bill on Twitter at Norathustra and Michael on Twitter at Zool.